Hello everyone, I'm Samantha Jane Smith.
And I'm Jacob Keynes, and you are listening to the Classical Queer Podcast. This podcast, Sammi speaks with the Bay Area Rainbow Symphony director and violinist Andy Jih about the history of the symphony and its role in queer music and its future plans. We'll also listen to the music of India Gailey, who is a cellist, and we'll listen to a piece, one of them, written by India, as well as a piece by New York-based composer Yaz Lancaster.
So welcome everyone. This week I'm very pleased to have Andy Jih, who is a violinist and also president of the board of directors with the Bay Area Rainbow Symphony. Welcome, Andy.
Well, thank you so much, Sammi. Glad to be here.
Great. I think probably the first thing is maybe you'd like to tell our audience a little bit about the Bay Area Rainbow Symphony, what it is, and a little bit about how it started.
Yeah, happy to. So I've been with the orchestra since about 2013. So the Bay Area Rainbow Symphony started in 2008, and it's nonprofit, community-driven organization in the San Francisco Bay Area in the U.S. And so it's community-driven. All of the musicians are professionals in other industries. We get together and perform roughly 4 concerts per year. And everyone else has day jobs. We've had a rotating crew throughout the many years. So I've been with the organization almost a decade at this point, which is pretty wild to say. And I've been just a violinist, and only in the past few years joined the board. So we tend to perform sort of a mix of music, classical and instrumental music. We do try to highlight at least one LGBTQ composer and or soloist per concert. And then we also, Dawn Harms, who is our music and creative director, one of her goals in our programming is to ensure that we always have at least one piece composed by a woman, if not more. So we try to create and highlight as much, try to create a programming that is inclusive and sort of drives forward that mission. That's sort of the high level sort of overview of what we do at the Bay Area Rainbow Symphony. We go by bars for short.
Okay, we'll use bars then. It's a bit shorter to say, yeah. So as the president of the board of directors, what's your role within that? What does the board do, and how does it interact with the orchestra and that itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the board in general is responsible for ensuring that the organization has the finances to continue to operate, and that from a governance perspective, that we're continuing to operate in means that are sort of above board, ensuring that we are a sound organization, either from a finance perspective or just from how we're operating in general. Every single board member currently is also an orchestra member in the group. So there's very much sort of this tight knit, we are everyone on the board is someone who joined the orchestra as a member, as a player, and then cares deeply. And really a board member is, it's also a volunteer gig. Essentially we're volunteering our time and also our money to help ensure that the orchestra can continue to perform and contribute, hopefully back to the community and what we do. And so the board is about 11 people currently, and we do a mix of things. Folks from their day jobs might have experience in marketing or operations, or we have some folks who also have professional experience working in arts organizations. So people have it's a very mixed group in terms of folks' expertise and talent. So people sort of go into different areas, and some folks are focused on marketing in terms of the website or social media or branding. Other folks are focused on the financing side of like making sure that our finances are in order and that everything is set. So so that's kind of the division of labor, and my responsibility as president is really just helping to make sure that all of these things kind of continue along and we're moving in the right direction.
I guess obviously with the COVID effect we've had over the past couple of years, this has been quite a tough gig to have. I mean, you've obviously had restrictions and this kind of thing. So how have you coped with that as an orchestra?
Yeah. I think every arts organization, especially performing arts, and so many others have been drastic, very strongly impacted by COVID and everything. I think Bars has been relatively fortunate in that we don't have any physical space. We don't own or like regularly lease a venue, or basically most of our costs are incurred when we put on a concert. So for better or for worse, because we didn't have any concerts for the better part of a year and a half or so, we more or less went into a stasis phase. We're just kind of, a chrysalis, waiting to emerge as a butterfly, and so thankfully, we're able to weather the storm. We mostly just put things on pause. We had some calls as a group, just sort of internally, just to keep the community and the orchestra sort of together. But we thankfully weren't too negatively impacted. We've now had 2 concerts since the beginning of the pandemic. So we had one last November, and then also one in March of this year, and both went really, really well. We were really pleased and surprised by the support that we got from the audience. And I think we in the Bay Area have been relatively fortunate from a sort of masking and vaccination perspective. I think the folks I know it varies depending on the geographic region. So I think we've been pretty fortunate, and most folks have been very accommodating, both in the orchestra and the audience members of, we're going to require proof of vaccination and boosters. We're going to mask and, except of course for the brass and woodwinds, and we haven't really had much, fuss about that. So I think overall we count ourselves among sort of the luckier ones, the luckier organizations.
That sounds good. I mean, I guess from my perspective, I'm not terribly musical. I mean, I guess the main issue is keeping up your practice and actually playing together during that time. I mean, I guess that must have been the most difficult thing. Or, I know some groups have tried to have sort of remote sessions and this kind of thing. Is that how you worked, or did you just go, I'm just going to practice on my own here and do that kind of thing?
Yeah. To be frank, we didn't try anything along those lines. We'd heard, so Dawn, who's our creative and music director, she's also a violinist in the San Francisco Opera. And so just from chatting with her, the opera had done a bunch of, they tried these sort of asynchronous remote recording, performing together kinds of things, which I think were, a really great way to sort of keep together and sort of continue to make music. But at the same time, there's a lot of technical challenges and it just it's not the same, right? So I think most folks ended up just, practicing on their own. And once we sort of got back together last fall for our November concert, I think it was, I think we're, depending on the person, I will only speak for myself. Like, I was certainly a bit rusty, but I'm glad that many of the other orchestra members kept up with their practicing throughout. So I think we were able to be in a good spot, I think. So I think it worked out.
And I guess there was quite a lot, as you say already, probably quite a lot of pent up, I don't know, what is it, pent up feeling that was going to come out when you started having concerts again, both from the orchestra and also from the people as well. Everyone wants to get out and see live music. So I guess that was quite an exciting time for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Pent up energy, pent up demand, pent up, just feelings, right? Both from a player and from the audience member, like everyone just, it was cathartic, right? Like when we all got together for that first concert, where we were all able to be in a room together and play, and we felt very safe and fortunate to be in a place where we could perform and we could trust that our audience was watching out for one another and for us. I have some friends, a friend of mine who's an opera singer. She, has done some gigs since the pandemic has started and has traveled to different parts of the country in the U.S. and honestly hasn't had a positive experience often. Where she's performing and singing and everyone in the audience is mask free, and all these considerations, and especially for her when her instrument is her voice and all of those and her lungs, right, like her ability to sing that way, like so I think we count ourselves as, again, quite lucky and fortunate to have that community here, and then the audience is very supportive of that.
I think there's something I was going to talk about a bit later, but you've kind of brought it up already.
Sure,
I mean, you live in quite a special part of the world for queer people. I mean, it's kind of like in a way, the gold standard. It's an environment which is very welcoming, generally, and kind of positive, which I guess is a fantastic atmosphere to play in.
Yeah.
I guess, I mean, I guess it must be quite positive. I mean, I guess I would sort of, having been, I'm sure you've been to places which aren't as welcoming for queer people. I mean, I guess there's this question about, what's your feeling like? I mean, obviously living in the Bay Area is a great place for people to live in, for queer people. Yeah. But, obviously that's not everywhere. So I guess, do you see this as part of, kind of your role in a sense of the Bay Area Symphony? I know you're a Bay Area focus, but to try and at least encourage people and give a positive view of queer people to the world.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think from my perspective, I've been living in San Francisco in the Bay Area for over a decade, at this point, and what drew me to the area, I mean, what brought me to the area was work, very candidly. But obviously I was very, very excited to be here because of how much this, San Francisco and the Bay Area overall has been sort of this beacon for many queer people, and continues to be by and large, an incredibly inclusive and welcoming space for queer folks. The orchestra itself, we are currently, it's in the name, Bay Area Rainbow Symphony. So we have only performed historically here. I would love for us to, we recognize that we have the privileges of being, like, the environment sort of created this symphony and this orchestra. But we would love to see more and more queer ensembles, orchestras. I know there's a pretty large contingent of gay choirs out there, but it's also with orchestras. I'd love to see many more, queer orchestras out and about. So if we could help, be at the very least just an example, and hopefully sort of show that there is a way for other folks to do that. In some ways, I actually think it's actually quite easy for us to exist in this environment. And if anything, I think folks who are in less welcoming environments and less welcoming parts of the world to queer people, I admire those folks, because they're going up against stronger headwinds, right? And overt hate in some cases. Absolutely. And so I think I'd love to chat with them if they're out there. And one thing that we have talked about for a very long time but would love to do is to travel at some point and perform in other areas. So, nothing concrete just yet, but certainly something we'd love to be able to do.
This is something which in a lot of our podcasts we come back to is quite often is about queer community, not only in a local area, but around the world. And one of those things we often discuss is how to get classical music in particular, because classical music generally seems to have a little bit of a problem with getting queer people into it. I mean, in general, it's not, there's a lot of choirs, but in general, getting queer people into classical music seems to be more difficult. And I guess this is why I think your bars is a little sort of shining light for orchestral work, in the sense that there aren't many orchestras. I think there's another one in Berlin, maybe there's one or two around the world, but it's not it's not common. And I guess that's kind of in a way, that's a really great thing, but it's also maybe a little bit of a burden in a way, if you see what I mean, to be one of the few people maybe look to you to be, this beacon.
Yeah, I think I couldn't answer that. I think for me, more than anything, in terms of my experience, from school, and then just I wasn't professional. I didn't study professionally or anything like that. But when I was in high school and then college, I think there are certain personalities that might gravitate towards choir, and there are other personalities that gravitate towards classical and instrumental music. So I think there's something there as well in terms of choirs, or general, my experience is like choirs are more extroverted, more gregarious. They often have a lot of these like very strong sort of like social, like I just remember in high school, right? Like the choirs are just like, that they're there. Whereas like instrumental, musicians can be a little bit more reserved at times. So I wonder if there's some level of, just sort of personality types as well that sort of influences those, that behavior, perhaps.
Yeah. How do you think? It's another question which we quite often talk about on the show, is how being queer affects your view of music, and maybe the way you play it, or maybe the way you interpret it. Do you feel that's something that you take with you, or something that's inside, or do you think, that's not there isn't that kind of view of it? I mean, some people say yes and some people no, I guess.
Yeah. I can only speak for myself as Andy, not, I don't speak certainly for all of the musicians in bars or Don, for example, but I think it's hard to disentangle. So I guess my answer is yes. Right. I feel like my view of the world and my identity as, a gay cis man, I think that has a pretty strong effect on, how I move through the world. And at times, it's not always conscious, right? It's not always like top of mind, right? Like every single action that I do is like, because I'm a gay cis man, I'm going to do these things,
people tend to have this view that you somehow are thinking about being gay or trans all the time, and that's the only thing that matters in life, and you've got a life to live, but you don't really, kind of, so.
Yeah, exactly. It's not this like every single, so you know what I mean. And so in terms of music, I do think of how, much of classical music has historically been written by, cis white men, generally straight, at least that we know of. And so from my perspective as queer and Asian, I think of I do think of what are things that we can do that are a little bit different, right? Like, can we make, I view music as like, I think that's maybe a bit of the tension at times, especially with a classical organization, because when people go to a classical music concert, I think they sort of expect, oh, I'm here, I'm going to listen to the Tchaikovsky, I'm going to listen to the Mozart, I'm listening to the Beethoven. It's like cut and dry in a lot of ways. And so I try to think of like, what are the things that at the same time it's 2022, let's try to do something different. Let's try to make it ours, right? Like music is to be performed and interpreted in different ways. Whether we're overtly like making, Mozart or Beethoven like queer, I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but I certainly think that influences how we want to play it, right? Like how we are feeling the music and and the audiences that we perform for. And so, that's sort of a very long-winded answer.
But I think it's kind of a thing that's built into us. You mentioned something else then, if you don't mind me asking the question. As you said, it's classical music is a very white, generally European or European American, but European, culture. As an Asian person, and there's a lot of great music from the rest of the world, which we kind of ignore in classical music. have you got any feelings about that, or how that influences you, or how we should maybe go and look more widely at what we mean by classical music, maybe?
Yeah. It's a great question. So just by way of, quick background, I was born in Taiwan, but my family moved to the US when I was a little baby. So American, by and large. And so playing the violin and playing classical music growing up, essentially it's white European dudes, by and large. And so that certainly colored my perception growing up. And it wasn't until, in the last 15 years that I really started to push myself to be like, why on the one hand, it feels like a long time ago, but at the same time, 15 years isn't really that long, of like, why are we only playing music by old white European dudes?
Yes.
Absolutely. And so at bars, one of the things that really interested me was the push for, at the same time, there are many musicians who, these are great pieces, right? It's great music, it's great art, but there's also great music and great art elsewhere in the world that we've never played. So I think one of the things that by trying to mix, create and highlight lesser known works by people of color, by queer people, by women in classical music, I think it is exposing both the players and the audiences to different pieces. And so we've been trying to push more and more into these areas. And I think the hard part is it takes time, right? The easy thing is to do the Tchaikovsky. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Tchaikovsky. He's like one of my favorites. I keep just picking on him because,
he's good. He's not bad. He's got done
he's all right. He's all right.
Yeah.
He's all right.
He's all right. Yeah.
But and so I think the honest answer is it takes time and it takes work, right, to find and curate the music that the members will be interested in, that the audiences will be interested in, and there's no shortcuts to it, right? But I do agree. I think it is work worth doing, of exploring and finding and engaging with the To be clear, it's like people all over the world have been writing classical music. It's just that the programming has often led to predominantly music of a certain kind, and so. It's incumbent, I think, on organizations to do the work. If it's something, instead of just lip service, actually doing the work to find those pieces and the performers and bring them in. And it takes time and energy. as with all good, the good thing is also the hard thing, yeah.
And it's kind of interesting because there is this kind of media thing about this. I mean, I've noticed in a radio show that I have, if I start playing too much that's outside Tchaikovsky, Mozart, Bach, you start getting people going, well, why aren't you playing Tchaikovsky, Mozart, Bach? And it's kind of like, and you look at the big radio stations and that's all they play. I mean, the classical music stations that I'm familiar with, play 98%. It's the same playlist that everybody else plays. And it's really hard for composers who are women, who are queer, or are Asian, African, or anybody else that's outside that, to break in because of this kind of cultural flywheel that keeps this same stuff going around. Exactly. And so it's nice to see an orchestra, as you said, Dawn is heavily is trying to push women composers as well, which I think is another area we're obviously very short of.
Yeah. I totally agree. I think one thing that I've noticed, at least locally, and I haven't spent as much time seeing sort of in other orchestras in other parts of the world, is that the San Francisco Symphony here, they've been doing more classical and orchestral work that is tied to movies and video game scores and soundtracks. And there was a part of me a few years ago that would have been like, oh, it's different. It's cute, but it's different. And as of late, I've noticed the local classical music, the big classical music radio station here in San Francisco is KDFC. They've been playing more of that music as well. And, I also happen to be a video gamer. So there's a part of me that sort of separated those like I kind of bucketed it in terms of like, oh, it's like high art, low art. And I've certainly shifted my perception of that as of late of I love this music, but I had this own sort of like prejudice that I'd like taught myself of like, oh, video game music and movie soundtracks are lesser than, and revisiting them, like, if this is what I think this music is great, and B, if this is what gets younger people and queer people engaged in orchestras, that's great. And so I've been really pleased to see hear KDFC playing, music from Final Fantasy soundtracks or Lord of the Rings or, any number of these, orchestral pieces. So I think that might be an avenue, at least in terms of not overtly queer, but at least just not music written by dead people.
I think one of the things you said there, which I think is really true, is you've got this hierarchical of like composers almost, or types of music tradition, and it's kind of like yes, unless you listen to the most obscure piece of Mahler that's extremely difficult to listen to, then you're not worth, you don't know anything, kind of thing. There's like, and then you go down to the easier, and if you go down to Strauss, well, that doesn't count so much because it's all waltzes. And then you've got video gaming, and then you've got Lord of the Rings and all this kind of thing. It's a very hierarchical structure that seems to exist in a lot of the classical world to some level.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think in a lot of ways, like, it's whatever gets people engaged, and if it moves people, it's art, right? Like, to be clear, I'm also not like an academic, or like I can't really necessarily speak to these level, like these kinds of things in like a critic or like that level of discussion. But at the very least, from my perspective, like if it moves people, if people enjoy it, let's do it. It's great.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think it's about, exactly. And it's also about like finding a balance too, right? Like, there's their audiences, their members, and also, I speak as a violinist, like a player myself. Like, if we play something that is particular, like very current, like brand new piece off, a lot of these pieces can be very challenging or atonal and amelodic, and it's very challenging to play and also very hard to listen to folks who might not, like, I don't even have sometimes the literacy for some of these pieces where I'm like, I don't really get what's going on. And so at the same time, like trying to figure out like, how do you play something that is familiar and pleasing by sort of like the traditional ear, but then also how do we push and expand boundaries in other ways? So it's sort of figuring out sort of like where it's also, I think, dangerous to just 100% stay in the comfort zone, right? So it's sort of figuring out like where do we push, right? And I think that's maybe part of sort of that queer lens of like, how do we push, not sometimes overtly, sometimes just by existing, like how do we push these boundaries and do something different?
As you say, by actually bars existing is actually pushing a boundary, and that's kind of good, kind of a positive thing. I should say that a person we interviewed a few months ago, a trans woman composer in the UK, sort of made the point that you can play a piece of music of her music, and if you hate it, that's okay. That's kind of all right, as long as it gets a response, as long as there's something that you got, God, I really hate that, or I really love it, or this kind of thing. That's better than going, I don't really have an opinion. So I've kind of come around to the conclusion that all of this art is great, even if you look at it and you go, it's not for me, but at least it's got some response. And I think that's kind of important.
Exactly. And I think the response I think what that kind of art in general, I think the question is like, oh, that's not for me. Maybe then ask why, right? Like sometimes people just have that like immediate, like, oh, ick, and then they walk away. And that's the end of the exploration. But I think there's the question of take it just another step further. Why does that not work for me? Or why do I like this? Right. Like, and I think that's what great art can do.
Exactly. Yeah, that sounds great. I got a couple of other little questions. So one thing just to make clear is that my understanding is that bars actually will have queer and non-queer people in it playing as well. It's quite a mix of people. Anybody can come along and play. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. That's right. I missed that point earlier. So we are truly inclusive in the sense that, queer, straight, all kinds of folks are welcome to play in the orchestra. I mean, we do have an audition process, so that's kind of a bar.
You've got to be able to play. You've got to be able to play music.
But yeah, so we've done some surveys in the past. We haven't done one in the past couple of years, but I'd say in general, it's maybe about 50-50 in terms of folks who self-identify as LGBTQ or queer in some way, and 50% straight. But it certainly evolves and changes over time. It's like for any given concert, there are about 60 to 80 musicians, and we're a volunteer orchestra, so we understand that we are not the top priority. So depending on the concert, depending on the timing, we have kind of like maybe 100 to 120 people who kind of rotate throughout the course of the year. 120 people total, and then sort of a rotating cast of crew throughout from concert to concert.
That's a really logistical, I guess, nightmare as well, trying to work out who's got to come in and who's got to play. Gosh, have we got enough violas and this kind of thing? That must be quite a complex little business.
Yeah, it's really just done by a lot of the hard work and heart of Richard Horan, who's our executive director. So he manages all of the very tactical operations of booking the venues, booking the rehearsal space, making sure that we have programs, and managing that team. And so he, combined with often the section leaders, they're the ones who sort of manage. I think it helps just being able to delegate and say, okay, Michael, who's the concert master, just you just manage the violins. Great. You figure that out. Yeah. And then, Russ and Hans, they're the cello sort of co-principals. You just figure out the cellos, make it work.
Make it work.
I think exactly. Make it work. I'd say the strings are probably the most logistically, because it's the largest by number of people. And then also, because there's so many of us, I think people are a little bit more just kind of drop in and drop out. Whereas, I think in general, winds and brass are a little bit more consistent.
Yeah, I guess
I speak as a string player myself.
I was going to say, you sound like a string player. I was going to say, if you've got the one piccolo player and you need them and they drop out, then you're in trouble.
Exactly. Yeah. Whereas, violins is three are out. Okay, just boop, pop in the next.
Bring them in. Yeah. Bring them in. So what's next for the bars then? What's coming up in the next 6 months or so, and where are you going in the future, do you think?
Yeah, great question. So we have our Pride concert, which is coming up on June 11th, and we'll be performing in San Francisco. We're just now navigating some of COVID things again coming up, so it's sort of at this point kind of a concert by concert basis, but we're very excited for our June 11th concert. So we're going to be playing the Adolphus Hailstork fanfare on Amazing Grace. And then we also have a violinist and composer named Alyssa or Elisa. So apologies, Elisa Rose. She has sort of a bluegrass violin concerto called Embracing Ruth. So she's local to the Bay Area. She's also queer. And she also is, I believe, a faculty member at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. And then Tchaikovsky Symphony No. 2. So, got a mix of, contemporary and queer and, Tchaikovsky. So that's the next big concert that we have coming up. And then for the next year, we're doing the planning for the next season. So we're trying to line up dates. I think that's one of, jumping back to a COVID question of, how has that been to navigate is it's quite tricky trying to nail down and figure out exactly, what venues will be available. How do we get these dates? And then layer on top of that. It's just logistically quite challenging, pros and cons. We don't have we don't have an orchestra space or a venue or auditorium or anything like that we own. That'd be very expensive, but at the same time, we're sort of at the mercy and the whims of the venues that might be available. So, but that's how we're doing.
I'm sure it'll go well. Well, thank you very much for your time, Andy, and we look forward to hearing some concerts in the future.
Thank you so much, Sammi. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Today we have the opportunity to listen to a couple pieces by cellist India Gailey. I happen to know India quite well. We get to play together in a chamber ensemble called Alkali Collective here on the east coast of Canada. And every time I get the opportunity to work with India, it surprises me, although it probably shouldn't, but it surprises me how incredibly sensitive and complex a player India is. And so we're going to listen to two pieces this morning. One is by India, and one is by a composer, a wonderful queer composer named Yaz Lancaster. We're going to listen to the first piece by India, and this piece is actually by India Jih. This is called Ghost. And one of the things about India's practice, because I happen to know India, is that they play a lot of solo works for cello, which, I mean, there are, of course, many solo works for cello around. There's like a long history of playing solo cello works, but I think what always fascinates me about the pieces that India chooses to play, are there not the typical pieces for solo cello, as in they don't access the normal soundscape of cello writing, or if they do it in a really interesting new way. And often the solo pieces that India plays are just a little step off the beaten path and require more complex and deeper understanding of what the piece is asking to play. And that requires both India as a player to have a deeper understanding, but also the piece itself is written from likely a very different viewpoint, and then therefore asking the musician to perform differently and perform in a more careful and complex way. And so this piece, which is actually written by India, is both. It's layered in the way that India is both playing it and has written it. And so here is Ghost. We're going to listen now to a piece called Diep en Wijn, a la the Netherlands, by composer Yaz Lancaster. And Yaz is a black and trans composer living in Harlem, in New York, and so there's a wonderful connection, I'm sure, which is not lost on them, between the Netherlands and the United States. And I've had the pleasure of playing Yaz's work before, also in this same collective with India, in Alkali Collective. And I really deeply love playing Yaz's works. They really, again, maybe similar to the solo cello piece by India that we just listened to, they write from a different space, and you can tell they're writing from a different space. And so the music is more complicated in a good way. It's more deeply connected to the person, and I think therefore it matters deeply who is playing it. And so not that I think Yaz's music can't be played by just anybody. I'm sure there's an accessibility that works for everyone, but I think having somebody who deeply understands Yaz as maybe a person or their life, or has a friendship or a connection with them, matters very much to how they get performed. And so this is India and her interpretation of Yaz's piece. I hope you enjoy.
would do. So quietly.
So that's all for this episode. You've been listening to the Classical Queer podcast, and Jake and I look forward to being with you next month. The incidental music is courtesy of Jared Miller, and the show was produced by Samantha Jane.